Welcome to Alpha. You're really beginning, for those who've never been through Alpha, the beginning of a wonderful adventure. Alpha, some people have declared, is the most successful evangelistic program in the history of the church. Now, that seems a little exaggeration, and who knows how to judge that. But the reality is, literally millions of people all over the world in multiple languages and cultures have gone through Alpha. Alpha started, actually, in an Anglican church in London, and it was a program for new people who were coming to the church. And one of the reasons it's called Alpha, Alpha, as you know, but you may know, is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. And you know Alpha because of the word alphabet. Literally, alpha beta is where the word alphabet comes from. And it's literally a course in the ABCs, we would say in English, of Christianity. And when Holy Trinity Brompton started the course, it was because they were discovering people were coming to the church. It was a very exciting church, and people were attracted to it. But one of the things they discovered is people knew almost nothing about Christianity. And that's actually become more and more the reality in our culture. When I grew up, there was enough sort of Christianity in the culture. Even if you didn't go to church, you at least picked up the basic story. And they began to discover people knew nothing about Jesus Christ, knew very, very little about the Christianity at all. And so they developed this course, a basic ABC introduction to Christianity. And they created a wonderful format. The symbol of Alpha is a big question mark. Wherever you go, you see signs, and it's always a logo of a question mark. And part of the reason this is important for later tonight when you go to your discussion groups, the environment is not just me giving you a bunch of lectures and tell you what you should believe or what's true. It's really an engagement with Christianity, and we want you to question it. We want you to, when you get into your discussion groups, it's supposed to be an environment of free inquiry. So don't feel in any way embarrassed or shy about arguing with the stuff. And that's part of what the real, I think, success of Alpha has been. It's a free place to think these things through. But the other meaning of Alpha itself is actually in the last book of the Bible. St. John, by the way, we're in St. John the Evangelist parish tonight, where we're taping this, and that's named after St. John, one of the gospel writers, the fourth gospel, but also the writer of the last book of the Bible. And the book of Revelation of John, as it's called, starts with this amazing experience. St. John is in prison. He's been in prison for his Christianity. And he is in this prison cell. Actually, I've been there. I've been to Patmos. It's the island of Patmos. And there's a cave there where John was, where he had this vision and wrote probably his gospel as well as the last book of the Bible. But while he's there, he has this experience, this supernatural, transcendent experience of the presence of Christ speaking to him. And of course, he's so terrified, it says he falls on his face. He's trembling. And Jesus speaks to John and tells him, don't be afraid. And then he says this very interesting thing. I am the Alpha and I am the Omega. I am, Alpha being the first letter of the Greek alphabet, Omega is the last letter of the Greek. I am the beginning and the end. And really, that's at the heart of what this course is all about, is that Jesus Christ is the beginning and the end. In a few minutes, I'm going to actually move into my talk tonight about who is Jesus. But the whole idea of the question mark, all the subtitle of the course is the questions of life. And we're talking about the big questions, not just how do I get a parking spot and how do I get my Social Security. The big questions of life. Why do I exist? Is there any meaning to life, or is it just a random accident that we exist here? What does it mean to be a human being? Is there a God? And if there is a God, what is that God like? And the big questions of life, why is there evil? Why is there suffering? And of course, the biggest question of all, what happens when we die? I mean, we're all going to die. The death rate has stayed stable, one per person. And that's going to, and so these are the bigger questions. Now, a lot of times people can run through life and never ask these questions. I forget who it was Descartes or Plato, I forget who said, an unexamined life is not worth living. But this course, in a way, is to stop in the midst of all the business of life and spend some time asking the big questions of life. And as a Christian, we believe that the answer to those questions, I am the Alpha and the Omega, I am the beginning and the end, I am the answer, Jesus says, to all the questions of life. Now you can argue with that, and I hope you will, but in a sense that's the proposition and the foundation of this course. To ask the big questions and to look to Jesus, who Christians believe is the answer to all those big questions. So with that, I want to spend a little time tonight. The first topic of the 12 topics, I believe we have 12 evenings together. The first topic tonight is, who is Jesus? Well, in one sense, Jesus is a historical person who lived 2,000 years ago. Now, occasionally there's scholars who come along and propagandists who try to say Jesus never existed. It's funny, in the communist era, if you went to a communist dictionary and you looked up Jesus, it would say, a mythical figure who never existed. But of course, that was communist propaganda. But the reality is, I think any self-respecting historian knows, no matter what you believe about Jesus, that there was a man. Jesus is actually a Jewish name. That's the Greek version of Yeshua, which was his Hebrew name. That's the name he would have grown up, which actually is Joshua. And interesting enough, the name itself, because in the Bible, a person's name always has significant meaning. The name Jesus, the name Yeshua, the name Joshua literally means God saves. So that's the name that was given to him. According to the Bible, it was an angel who gave that name to Jesus. Whether you believe in angels or not, that's another story. But according to the Bible, it was an angel who came to Mary and said, you will name him Jesus. Well, Jesus of Nazareth, as a human being, lived. It's very easy to remember when he lived because our whole calendar is based on the date of his birth. Even if you don't believe in Jesus, your own birth date and death date are around his. So we're in the year 2013 because we're 2013 years after the birth of Jesus Christ. And according to the Bible, we know a few things about his birth, that he was born in a little town called Bethlehem, and that for most of his life, he never went far. He never wrote a book, but we know almost nothing about his childhood. In the Bible, there's only one story about him as a child. When he's 12 years old, like all adolescents, he runs away from his parents and heads out on his own. But we know very little. And then he has 3 years where he is an itinerant preacher and healer. And at the end of that 3 years journey, he is crucified and killed. And yet, I love what Phillips Brooks, I don't know if you know who Phillips Brooks is. You know, most of you, we're in the Boston area as we're filming this. The largest, one of the great architectural gems of Boston is Trinity Church in Copley Square. I'm sure you've been there. That's considered one, people from all over the world come there for the architecture. But that is an Episcopal church, and in the late 1800s, the rector of that church was a man named Phillips Brooks. Now, you all know Phillips Brooks because he wrote our old little town of Bethlehem. Matter of fact, he wrote that after going to Bethlehem, and he was so moved by his experience, he wrote that beautiful, beautiful hymn that we sing at Christmas. But Phillips Brooks was a great preacher, and there's a great statue of him. He was also a big man. I think he weighed about 350 pounds, and he was a big, big man, and there's a great statue of him at the side of Trinity Church where he is with Christ behind him, sending him out to preach the gospel. But I got this one time as a Christmas card, and I only found out later that it was actually written by Phillips Brooks. But you may have heard this, you may have seen it, you may have gotten it on a Christmas card yourself. Jesus was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family. He never owned a home. He never went to college. He never visited a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place he was born. He did none of the things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. Another betrayed him. He was turned over to his enemies, and he went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. And while he was dying, his executioners gambled for his garments, the only property he had on earth. And when he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 centuries have come and gone. Now, he wrote this 100 years ago. We can now say 20 centuries have come and gone. And today, Jesus is the central figure of the human race. All the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as that one solitary life. I think if you ask the question, who is the most influential human being that ever lived? I think most people, if they really look at history, would have to say Jesus Christ. And despite all his simplicity, his poverty, his nothingness in the worldly sense, he has had the most profound influence on human history. And so even if you don't believe anything else about Jesus Christ and about what the church says about him, I think we can all, to some extent, at least make a positive case that he is the most influential person that ever lived. But of course, Christianity says more than just that. It wasn't just he was like the greatest human being that lived, or the brightest, or the most inspiring. There are three things that Christianity says, and the whole of the Christian message is based on these foundations. The first is that Christianity says that after he was killed, he rose from the dead. Now, people don't rise from the dead, so this is a pretty remarkable sort of statement to make. But that's what the early Christians said. They said that after he'd been killed, and if you read the record in the Bible, they did not expect him to be raised from the dead, although he himself predicted it, but I don't think they believed him. And in fact, at his death, they were completely disillusioned. They all ran away. They all fled. There's a very interesting story. In one of the appearances of Jesus, he meets two of his disciples, and they're walking along the road. It's called the Road to Emmaus. There are a lot of beautiful paintings of this scene. And they're walking along, and suddenly Jesus appears to them, but they don't recognize him. They're so downtrodden. They're so depressed. And one of them says, we thought he was the Messiah, the Christ. In Judaism, they expected a Messiah who would come along, and they thought Jesus was the Messiah. But obviously, he was not. They had given up all hope. They didn't expect him. They thought they'd followed someone who turned out to be a false Messiah. And then Jesus reveals himself to them. And in a way, that happened with all the stories of the resurrection. These people who were utterly disillusioned not only had a whole renewal of their faith by the experience of the risen Christ, but almost all of them died. I mean, people generally do not die for a lie and lay down their lives for some lie or some hallucination. They all were so convinced that this Jesus whom they'd followed for 3 years truly had conquered death and was risen from the grave. St. Paul, who was one of the earliest and first writers in the New Testament, said, if Jesus Christ has not been raised from the dead, then the Christian faith is in vain, and it is an illusion, and that we as Christians have been lying. But, he goes on to say, Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead. The resurrection is the foundation of the Christian faith. For example, in our liturgical calendar, the reason we have Sunday when most Christians go to church, because remember, Christianity came out of Judaism. It's Saturday, it's still to this day, is the Sabbath for Jews. But Christianity changed the Lord's Day from Saturday to Sunday because of the resurrection. And whenever the early Christians, wherever they went, this is one of the things they preached constantly, that this Jesus who was crucified has been raised from the dead. And not only has he been raised from the dead, by his Spirit, he's still alive. They continued, one of the last things Jesus said before he ascended into heaven, he says, I will be with you forever. And that was the experience those early Christians had, a sense of his profound presence, risen from the dead in the Spirit. They had a sense, it wasn't just a historical figure who they followed or someone's teachings that were great and they were trying to listen and obey those teachings. They lived with this conscious sense of his presence that gave them the strength and the vitality to go forth in their work. And then the second thing that the Christian faith says about Jesus is not only that he rose from the dead, but then in retrospect, as they look back at his death, which they, of course, at the time thought was a profound tragedy. In many ways, it was a tragedy. Here is a man who absolutely, in a way, was guileless and harmless. All he did was love people. And what did he get for all his loving? He got nailed to a cross. And if you know anything about Roman execution through crucifixion, it is probably the most heinous and sadistic form of torture anybody could ever devise. And for all his loving, Jesus was tragically nailed to the cross. And it did look like a tragedy. And in many ways it was a tragedy. Evil triumphing over good, hatred triumphing over love, darkness and mischievousness and lying and everything. If you read the story of the crucifixion, it's just full with everything that's evil about human beings. Political machinations, betrayal, denial, sadism. They spat on him, they mocked him. Everything that's dark about human beings was manifested in this, and he was a figure of light and love, even from the cross. I mean, can you imagine being tortured on a cross, and one of the last things he says on the cross is, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. I mean, it's just almost incomprehensible. So you see this clash. But as Christians began to more deeply penetrate into Christ's death, they began to be aware that it was not actually the triumph of evil over good and of hatred over love. In fact, in the mystery of what happened on the cross, something changed in the whole universe, in the relationship between humanity and God. Now, next week, I believe the topic is on the cross. So I'm not going to go on to a long dissertation about the meaning of the cross. But the cross is the central symbol transfer. After the resurrection, after they began to comprehend the mystery of the cross, then they began to ask in a much more deep way, well, who was this Jesus? I don't know, how many of you are old enough to remember the Lone Ranger? Remember that? It was, as a kid, it was one of my favorite TV shows, and every TV show ended the same. You know, Lone Ranger wore a mask, so no one knew who he was, and he had his sidekick Tonto, the Indian, and they would come and rescue people out west. And then at the end of the show, all the people in whatever little town they had rescued and saved people from bad people, at the end of the show, the Lone Ranger would be riding off in his Silver, his horse, say, "Hi-oh, Silver," and Tonto would be riding along with him, off in a cloud of dust, and all the people gathered in the town said, "Who was that masked man?" And in a funny way, that's what the early Christians, I mean, they had some sense that, I mean, you go back to the earliest encounter with Jesus, they thought him as a prophet, speaking the word of God. Of course, there were other prophets that had come before Jesus. He was a healer, but there were healers before him. Elijah healed and Elisha healed. There were healings in the Old Testament. He was obviously a great teacher. They called him rabbi, which is teacher. And he was a great teacher, but there were other great teachers. And they began to talk about him as the anointed one. That in Hebrew, it's the word Messiah, and it's translated, by the way, Christ. Christ, by the way, is not Jesus' last name. Jesus Christ is not Jesus Christ, son of Mary and Joseph Christ. All right, Christ was the Greek version of Messiah, and it meant he was anointed with the Holy Spirit. And in fact, he was. He had a power. They said he preached with an authority. He healed with authority. He had an anointing. But there were other Christs before him. I mean, the idea of being anointed was not unique to Jesus. But the one thing they began to most say that was radically different is they began to say that Jesus, in fact, was not just a great prophet, not just a great teacher, not just a healer, not just a rabbi, not just a Messiah. He was God. Now this is, in a way, the most radical statement and claim that Christianity makes about Jesus. That Jesus was God. John's Gospel, which is the last of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word dwelt among us." Became flesh and dwelt among us. That the God of eternity, at a particular point in time, in a particular place, beginning in the womb of his mother Mary, God became a human being. Now, that's a pretty extraordinary thing to claim about any human being. But that's what Christians claim. And I love what C.S. Lewis, in one of his books, says that, did I lose my quote? No, there it is. By the way, if you want a wonderful book as an introduction to Christianity, A Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis is probably, many people have been converted by reading that book. It's one of the best books on the Christian faith, the basic. But he says this: "Among the Jews, there suddenly turns up a man who goes about talking as if he was God. He claims to forgive sins. He says he has always existed. He says he's coming to judge the world at the end of time." Now let us get clear. Among pantheists, like the Indians, we talk about Indian Indians in India, anyone might say that he was part of God or one with God. There'd be nothing odd about it. But this man, since he was a Jew, could not mean that kind of God. God in the Jewish language meant someone outside the world who has made it and was infinitely different from it. And when you have grasped that, you will see that what this man said was quite simply the most shocking thing that has ever been uttered by human lips. Yet even his enemies, when they read the Gospels, do not usually get the impression of silliness and conceit. Still less to unprejudiced readers. Christ even says that he's humble and meek, and we believe him, not noticing that if he were really a man, humility and meekness are the very last characteristics we would attribute to someone who says the things he says. I'm trying to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim as God. That is the one thing you must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him, you can kill him, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us, and he did not intend to. I think that challenge by Lewis is really the challenge to every human being. Who was this Jesus? Who was this masked man? Was he really God? that he proclaimed and that his followers said about him? And if he was God, then not only is he the most important human being that ever lived, his life is the most important life that ever, the most important event that ever took place in the history of the human race and the history of the universe. And there it goes back to what I said at the beginning. Finally, why did Christ come into the world? Well, he is the answer to every human question. And somebody said, Jesus is the answer. Somebody said, what's the question? Well, I say, you name the question. All the things I said before. What's the meaning of life? What is God? Who is God? What is God like? What about death? What about suffering? What about evil? All those questions of human life, they're all answered for Christians in Jesus Christ. And so I hope over these next few weeks, as you journey through this basic course, in one sense it's going to be an intellectual journey, and it should be. The Bible says that we should love God with all of our mind. I do not believe Christianity is a religion where we'll leave your brain at the door and just be a gullible simpleton. I believe, frankly, Christianity is the most intellectually compelling and cogent and exciting intellectual challenge that there is. And I hope your minds will be stimulated. But Christianity is not just a set of principles or propositions or theological doctrines. It's a relationship with this Jesus. Because he is God, because he is risen, because he is alive. Christianity, above all, is relationship. And I pray that as you journey through this time, wherever you may be already in your spiritual life, you will grow theologically and spiritually, but most of all, you will grow deeper in relationship to Jesus. Thank you.